After the absolute chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe's leaders tried something, well, kind of radical. They designed a system they hoped would bring about a century of peace. But we all know how that century ended, with the First World War. So let's get into the story of how a system built for peace actually paved the road for one of the worst conflicts in human history. And yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It's a huge paradox. The very tools they created to stop a continent-wide firestorm somehow ended up feeding the flames. So how on earth did that happen? Let's break it all down. Okay, so our story really kicks off in a Europe that is just completely and utterly exhausted by war. The continent had been in a state of almost non-stop turmoil for a quarter century. Something had to give. I mean, just think about that for a second. 25 years of war. That's an entire generation that knew nothing but conflict. So the great powers, they weren't just looking for another temporary truce. No, they were convinced that Europe needed a fundamental redesign. The goal here was a lasting peace, to finally end this cycle of violence. You know, Napoleon's downfall wasn't a clean, one-and-done deal. He was defeated, he abdicated, but then he came back. This 100 Days return was a massive shock to the system. It basically screamed a message to the great powers: just putting the old kings back on their thrones is not going to cut it. They needed a real, robust security system for the whole continent, and they needed it yesterday. So the folks at the Congress of Vienna had some really clear goals. First up, the big one, balance of power. They wanted to make absolutely sure that no single country could run roughshod over Europe like Napoleonic France had done. They also wanted to restore what they called the legitimate monarchies. But what's really fascinating is that last point. They included France. They didn't want to punish it so badly that it would just come back seeking revenge. The idea was to bring France back into the family, so to speak. And all of this led to a totally new way of doing business, a really innovative system that we now call the Concert of Europe. Now, this core idea was pretty revolutionary for the time. Instead of every country just looking out for number one, the great powers basically agreed to treat Europe's stability like a shared problem. So, when a crisis popped up, the plan was to get in a room and talk it out before it could escalate into a massive war. And this new order kind of had two layers to it. On one side, you had the Holy Alliance. Think of this as the ideological club, three very conservative monarchies who were all about crushing revolutions wherever they appeared. And on the other side, you had the much more practical Quadruple Alliance, which was really just about keeping the peace and maintaining that balance of power. And right here is the central paradox of the 19th century. The system was, believe it or not, incredibly successful at preventing another huge continent-wide war for almost 100 years. But, and this is a big but, don't mistake that for a century of actual peace. This era was absolutely simmering with revolutions, uprisings, and smaller, contained wars. Because while all the diplomats were busy trying to keep a lid on things, these powerful new ideas were bubbling up from below. And they started putting immense pressure on that carefully built order. You see, the whole Vienna system was designed to squash revolutionary ideas. But there were two forces that just couldn't be contained by treaties: nationalism and liberalism. Nationalism, the idea that people with a shared culture and language should have their own state, was a direct threat to the big, multi-ethnic empires that were the bedrock of the whole system. For a long time, the system bent, but it didn't completely break. I mean, you have huge conflicts like the Crimean War and the wars that literally created modern Italy and Germany. These were massive, world-changing events. And yet, the Concert of Europe managed, somehow, to keep them contained, to stop them from turning into another continent-wide free-for-all. And then came 1871, the unification of Germany. This wasn't just another conflict. This was a geopolitical earthquake. A massive new industrial and military powerhouse just appeared, right in the heart of Europe. And just like that, the delicate balance of power they'd worked so hard on in Vienna was shattered, for good. So this brings us to the final act. This is where that old, flexible system of diplomacy starts to harden into something way more rigid and way more dangerous. Look at this shift. It's absolutely critical. The old way of doing things, flexible talks, slow and deliberate diplomacy, that gets replaced by an era of rigid opposing alliances. Diplomacy suddenly takes a backseat to military mobilization timetables. The goal isn't to manage a crisis anymore, it's to win it, and win it as fast as possible. And you can just see the dominoes start to fall. The new Germany changes how everyone sees threats, which leads to two heavily armed camps staring each other down. So now, when a crisis erupts, especially in a powder keg like the Balkans, it doesn't get resolved. It just climbs up the ladder of escalation along these rigid alliance lines. And in the summer of 1914, the system's emergency brake just failed. And this is where Europe found itself, a tinderbox. The whole system was so tightly wound with treaties and military plans that a single local shock, the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo, could trigger a complete and catastrophic collapse of the entire continent. There was just no room left to talk. Which kind of leaves us with one final big question to chew on. Was the Concert of Europe a huge success that gave the continent 100 years of relative stability, or was it really just a very, very long fuse, slowly burning its way toward the massive explosion of 1914? Definitely something to think about.